Bryan, come on up here with me. I'm grateful that you're here. We said that this week we would answer questions of y'all's about Jesus, and so Bryan's here with me to bail me out. So that's you've got to actually have the facts, and I'll just make stuff up. Okay, sounds good. No, but let's start by praying. Holy God, may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts and minds be pleasing to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Well, I wanted to start with this scripture about the temptations. Dick Rogers picked because he's focusing today, he's in the sanctuary, and he's focusing on the question of, did Jesus have free will? Could he have just lived his life however he wanted? And that's an interesting question. I feel like this story about the temptations shows that he absolutely could have chosen otherwise. That it wouldn't have been really temptations. It wouldn't have been any sort of show of his commitment to his own ministry if they weren't real. I mean, what do you think, Bryan? Have you?
Yes.
All right. No. Well, I mean, but it's a question because there's lots of art out there. The Last Temptation of Christ. Some of you guys may have seen that. All kinds of things that are out there that look at the question of, could Jesus have led a whole other kind of life? And I think as Christians, the way that we've seen it since the beginning is that what made him so amazing was that he was fully human, which meant he could make all kinds of bad choices, but he didn't. Now, we did have another question about, well, was Jesus ever in a relationship? And if you guys remember the Da Vinci Code, that's getting old now, but some of y'all may have read that or seen the movie. Well, that proposed that Jesus had an affair with Mary Magdalene, or were they married? Or
They were together.
They were together and had children. There's nothing in Christian tradition or any of the present day, the recordings from that time, certainly not the Bible, that would lead us to think that he did. But on the other hand, there's probably lots of stuff that's not in there. I think that's one of those things where if you want to believe he had relationship with someone and that somehow makes him feel more real to you or more approachable, I don't see that gets in the way of faith necessarily, but we don't have any concrete, I mean, unless do you know of, what do you think? Do you think Jesus had a relationship?
Now I know you're held to different bounds than I am because you're here every Sunday.
Go outside of the bounds, man.
Let me step out there for a minute.
All
What
right.
does it matter if Jesus had a relationship? I mean, honestly, does it change anything in how you see Jesus or how you respond to Jesus? Because to me, it makes Jesus maybe more human. It makes us have a deeper connection with it. I'm sorry, Ginger, I pace a lot. So, if we say, well, Jesus didn't have a relationship, well, what does that mean exactly? I mean, who are we talking about? A fully divine and fully human person if he's incapable or unable to have a relationship with another person? So to me, I kind of wonder, well, does it really change anything if Jesus had a relationship with Mary or not, or with his disciples for that matter? Does that change how we interact with Jesus? For me, no. Except it makes Jesus a little bit more human and maybe makes it a little bit easier for me to connect with Jesus in a more meaningful way.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. If we were Catholic, though, I dated this guy in school a long time ago, and I was talking about James, Jesus' brother. We know that he was Jesus' brother because it says so in the Bible. It's there in the Bible. And I thought he was like going to get violent or something. He was Catholic, and he had always been told that Mary was a virgin the rest of her life. She never was anything but pure. And so there are people that, now thinking about Jesus and maybe having a relationship, there are people who hold on to these ideas because the whole notion of physical intimacy is like unclean or something. Hey, but we're Methodists. So
forget that.
So we can be like, but some other folks are a little bit more.
There's a real disconnect in that, though, in that we don't. but we do, in a way, treat marriage as a sacrament.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And in the Catholic tradition, they say, okay, marriage is one of the sacraments, right? In Methodism, we say, well, it's kind of a covenant-ish,
sacrament-ish.
but it's not a sacrament in that Jesus didn't participate in it, so we don't consider it a sacrament. But that being said, there's something holy about marriage. There's something holy about relationships. There's something, there's something holy about physical intimacy. And to say, oh, that's not something that's dirty or that's bad, that takes away something that's really meaningful. And so.
But for the longest time, people have needed to control, I guess, that area of life. And so there's been lots of guilt the church has put on around those things, and this idea of it being dirty. The body was seen as kind of corrupt and awful. The body was the problem. If only we could just be pure spirit. But we don't see it that way anymore. Yeah. But so anyway, we do have, and so I guess a preface on this is we want to hear from you guys, your questions, but we have a Methodist viewpoint. And so, if it's different than what your viewpoint has been, tell us that too, because it's interesting to have those conversations. But do you guys have questions about Jesus? Yes, Miss Lacey.
Going back on what Bryan said about how Jesus
You take it.
uses his relationship, my question is, what if Jesus chose not to be in a relationship because he knew he was going to be crucified?
Oh, that's a really good question, Lacey. Lacey asked, what if Jesus chose not to be in a relationship because he realized he would be crucified? Ginger, what do you think about that?
Oh, Bryan. Well, I think that really reinforces this idea that he had free will. He could have very easily not wanted to put someone through the pain, although his disciples went through terrible pain through all of that and horrible heartbreak. But he could have chosen not to have a relationship for all kinds of reasons. The thing that gets tricky is all down through the ages, some parts of the church, the Catholic Church in particular, has said because Jesus didn't have a relationship, then therefore no one who's a priest should ever have a relationship. And when the Episcopal Church broke off, they said, well, yeah, we're going to have all kinds of relationships. And so that changed. But the Catholic Church still to this day they don't allow, they don't allow priests to marry. But yeah, he could have chosen not to, knowing full well what was coming and having a focus on, I've got to accomplish as much in my ministry as I can, and that could possibly be distracting or something. But that's a good question.
And I may jump off that latter point.
Okay.
That, Jesus had about 3 years of ministry, and he was cranking throughout all of that. And I will attest,
right.
It is very difficult to have a relationship and be in ministry, just within a local church kind of context. So I could see that being a point where Jesus said, maybe I don't have time. I don't know. I guess to me it doesn't really affect my faith, and so whether Jesus had a relationship or didn't have a relationship is kind of one of those things. I'm like, okay, I'm not sure what it matters, but that's just me. It's a good question though. Well done.
But I don't think that we could take from that, like let's assume he didn't, or we think he didn't. If I don't think we can take from that, therefore there's something that's not holy about marriage. So looping back to what you said, I think we see that as an important.
Thank you for reflecting back what I said, Ginger. That makes me feel more important.
How about anybody else? Questions?
Yeah. Okay. So. Let me put that in the form of a question. Some of Jesus' visions have been attributed to epilepsy from secular viewpoint, and what is our feeling on that one? Thank you for handing that right off to me, Ginger. All right. So there are certain things in the Bible that I think we can look at and we can attribute it to knowledge that we have now through science. All right? There's a great story about a guy named Legion, right? Possessed by thousands of demons. living out in the cemetery, scraping his face and hitting himself with rocks. And I mean, just a horrible sounding story about a guy that we would probably look at today and say, well, that just screams of mental illness. But that wasn't really the understanding of the time, right? You don't hear, well, I'm going to say it like this. Jesus doesn't offer a whole lot of prophetic vision in that, on this day and this time, this is going to happen. One of the only places that he really talks about it is the falling of the temple. Which, and of course, his coming back, which he said, not a generation shall pass before I return, and he was wrong about that. Maybe. Depends on what he meant by my return. So, I think we can look through the Bible and we can see science and attribute a lot of the things that have happened to scientific measures, and I don't think that really takes away from the story. And since I don't really know if it touches on anything that Jesus said. So, I don't know.
Well, the whole question of what to do with the miracles, because there are a whole lot of people that look at that and go, that's just not the way the world works. That's just not true, and I'm going to toss the whole thing out. So I'm sort of excited to hear that somebody's at least taking the miracles seriously, but wanting to give them some other explanation. Because then they have to at least be thinking, okay, well, these miracles happened in some form. And I guess it's one of those things that we all grapple with. Methodists, think and let think, we grapple with all of these things. There's no reason why Jesus couldn't have done all of the things that are talked about in the Bible. There are some things, though, Bryan, like you're saying, that we might look at and go, that sounds like severe mental illness in the man in the cemetery, or that looks like leprosy, or different things where we would have a more modern take. But as Methodists, we stand by Jesus being able to perform miracles, and we have the opportunity to learn more about him as a healer and him as a person of generous love through reading those. But makes sense.
I like your answer better.
Well, no, we're saying the same thing. Okay, Gregory. And then Katrina. We'll go Gregory and Katrina.
This isn't a question. This is just my opinion on what y'all were just talking about. All of the people who are saying, oh yes, it's all these things that happen in the Bible, they're attributable to these phenomena. It's not that, oh, these are just things that happen that were, oh, we don't know what's happening, let's just say God did it and move on. It's God moving through the rules of the world and acting. Like I read somewhere that the parting of the Red Sea, oh yeah, that's just a freak windstorm. Well, yes, in the Bible it does talk about how there was a great wind and it parted the waters. To me, that's God who moved through that wind and allowed the Israelites to cross the Red Sea. And yes, maybe all these people who were possessed by demons did just have mental illnesses, but Jesus was able to come through and heal their minds in some way that made them better. And we just didn't understand what was going on, so we didn't put it down.
I agree with that. I think that that's a really good point. A lot of people get hung up on, like, let's say, evolution and the way that the world was supposed to be created, the way it's described in Genesis, and they think, well, these don't fit. One of the great things about the United Methodist Church, and I imagine most of the mainline denominations, is that we see both working together. We absolutely see evolution as God's action of how this creation is continually creating. And so we don't think, oh, well, now we can dismiss it because it's evolution. No, that's this awesome way that God chooses to continue creating, always at work, always at action in the world. And so I think that that's a really good point. People, oh, just a wind. Yeah, but a wind that was of God and that was used for God. I think that's a good point.
And we talk about, well, there aren't miracles happening in the world today. And I think the fact is there are. I mean, even with science and all of these things, we look at the infinitely big universe and we discover something new every single time we look out into the heavens. We look at the infinitely small and we discover that there are particles in the world that just kind of appear and then disappear, and we don't know what happens to them, and it defies all logic and reason. And we got doctors who go about and do these amazing things in surgery. My dad's a lung transplant survivor. I mean, he's got somebody else's lung in his body. That's amazing to me. And then we have doctors who, I have no reason to believe that you should be alive, and yet here you are. I mean, we are surrounded by miracles. It's just how we look at them. I mean, yeah, we can say, okay, we can write that off and we can say that, but it still doesn't take away from the wonder and the fact that God is alive and acting in the world. So, really solid. Yes.
Katrina.
Oh, yay, hey.
Okay, my challenge is how the higher ups kind of picked and choose what they wanted to go into the Bible.
Oh.
So, I really don't know how to put that in a question.
No, that's a question people have asked for a long time. There were these documents. Now, for the longest time, they had what we call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And so that was used in the Jewish faith for a long, long time and was kind of set. It was on scrolls. They had that. Then, after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the first thing that started happening, because they thought he was coming back right away, was that letters were being written, particularly by Paul, because he was moving from church to church, starting up churches with Gentiles, and that was so new. The Jewish people didn't think the Gentiles were worthy, but Paul did. He had felt this revelation of Christ for everyone, but he was moving all the time. So as soon as he would leave one church, they would start fighting or they would have something go wrong, and he was writing letters. So the letters were the first thing. And then the Gospels started being written from people's own remembrances and bringing those stories together. And they served particular communities. These Gospels came out. There was a Johannine community. And we don't know huge amounts about them, but we can deduce it kind of from the text. Mark is considered the oldest. And the others, with John being the relatively newest, it's got a lot of Greek influence that you see in it. So when they started looking at what do we include and what don't we include, there were councils that met. There was this council at this place called Nicaea in 323, and they looked at what have Christian communities used to show them the truth of Jesus Christ. What have people used that has actually built them up in the Word? What are reliable documents? And so those were starting to be gathered, which is kind of interesting because some things contradict, but they were wanting to acknowledge this sort of living reality. And then the letters of Paul got circulated around everywhere. There was a whole lot of debate about Revelation. A whole lot of people thought that didn't belong in, but it ultimately got in. So folks came together, but their question wasn't what's going to be best for us politically, like you think of committees meeting now. It was more what has been life-serving and what has promoted the true Christian faith and that for people. So that's how we ended up with our canon of 4 Gospels, these letters and things. But there was, in around the 200s, there were these group of people that were called the Gnostics. I think later they got called that. And they wrote a whole bunch of stuff. There's the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary. It goes on, and they're finding new ones. But again, those were in the 200s. To us, that's really ancient. But back then, that was a long time after Jesus lived. And they're really, really influenced by Greek ideas. There's where we get some of the ideas about the body is gross, and the sooner we can get rid of this body, the better, and spirit is the only thing. And that's not gospel at all. So when you hear about these that were cut out, those were so much later in the point of view of the people that were putting the canon together. They're still interesting to read, but they were really pretty late. Does that track with what?
Yeah, we still don't entirely agree. Like the church in Ethiopia still has a ton more documents in their gospel and their New Testament than we have in the Western world. So there's not, we like to pretend like there's some kind of agreement, and these heads that came together, but no, there's not. We're still trying to figure it out 2,000 years later.
They're
So,
definitely okay. We're starting to go late. This is our signal. Spencer was going to get a big hook and drag us off, but I think that another question I'm going to tell you. We're just going to do a whole sermon on this later. There was a question raised about should the government change its position on tax-exempt status, letting churches talk more openly. What would that mean in the Methodist Church? So we'll talk about that one on a later time. But just as a final thing, the Bible is there to reveal God's self to us and to change our lives. And any part of it has the potential to be life-giving for you. That doesn't mean every part will be. So like I could just as soon take my X-Acto knife and get rid of Joshua and toss it right away because I don't like it at all. But I could be like on a bad day, I could be reading and Joshua could somehow reveal God's self to me. I doubt it, but it could. But that's what it's for. But it's not the only thing that's for that. I've been listening to this podcast, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. So I recommend it to you if you're a Harry Potter person. Lola and I are reading Half-Blood Prince right now. And if there's ever something that enlivens my faith and my sense of self-sacrificial love and what it means to be a person of love, I see that in there. So God can put God's fingerprints on all kinds of things. The music that we hear up here. Do you want to say a final word before we move to communion?
no, I think you did it.
You sure? Would you lead us in the Lord's Prayer?
I can do that.
All right.
Will you pray with me? Our Father, who art in
In
heaven,
heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.